Hello, welcome back. Hope you're all doing well, and if it's your first time here, welcome. Now, today's case has been a tricky one to research. There isn't a lot of information available on it, but that's the nature of true crime cases. Some have extensive information and others don't. I don't think that should determine which ones I cover though, as they're all equally important. They can still teach us something, so I'll probably be mixing it up on my channel. Some will be in-depth longer videos and others will be shorter, depending on how much information I can find on each one. This case is tragic and incredibly shocking. The events that took place in the summer of 2004 couldn't have been predicted by anyone, and it shook a quiet, affluent village to its core. This is the case of Brian Blackwell. We begin today's case in Liverpool with Sidney Blackwell and his wife Jacqueline. We know that Sidney and Jacqueline both worked as buyers for the retailer Littlewoods. The finer details aren't clear here though, because there's some reports that say that they met as buyers for Littlewoods in the late 60s and then commenced a relationship 20 years later, and other reports say it was only when Jacqueline moved to Liverpool in the 70s that she met Sidney. Either way, they met through work and the pair began a relationship in the late 70s after both having been divorced from their previous partners. The two then moved into different lines of work, with Sidney becoming an accountant and business executive and Jacqueline becoming an antiques dealer, although at the time of this case both of them had retired from their respective professions. Now, it's been recorded that when the pair got together, Sidney had 2 grown children from his previous marriage, but Jacqueline didn't have any children. They got married in the early 80s and then received the incredible news that Jacqueline was pregnant. Jacqueline was 43 by this point and was desperate for a child, but struggled to get pregnant. And so when she did fall pregnant, it was incredible news for them both, and they were over the moon. So Jacqueline gives birth to their baby boy in West Lancashire in 1986 and they name him Brian Mark Blackwell. Now, sometimes Sidney went by the name Big Brian, but his actual name was Sidney. So I'll be sticking with Sidney just to keep things easier to follow between little Brian and Sidney, his dad. 2 years later, the family of 3 moved to a £350,000 bungalow in a quiet and affluent village just outside Melling, which is within the borough of Sefton in Merseyside. Merseyside is the area that you can find boroughs like St Helens and Liverpool. And little Brian grows up in a privileged area to a very devoted set of parents and is enrolled at a private school named Scarisbrick Hall. As Brian grows up, his parents soon realise that he's a very talented little boy. He's very intelligent, and when he turns 12, he moves school to Liverpool College, which is another private school which costs £7,300 per year. Brian excels in school, and this excites his parents. They have a very clever young man on their hands, to the point where they nickname him Brains. Brian's favourite subject at school is science, and he, of course, excels at it, and hopes to study medicine when he's older and become a doctor. Now, Brian's parents are a little overprotective of him, maybe because he was so badly wanted before he was born and he was a little miracle for them, or maybe because that's just how they were as parents, especially Jacqueline. They had high expectations for their son, particularly given that he was a very gifted young man. So Brian is an exceptional student at school and is also a talented tennis player, and his dad takes him to a tennis club to compete against others, and he is very good at it. The problem is because Jacqueline and Sidney are so focused on Brian making the absolute most of his intelligence, they make it his whole life. They don't approve of Brian socialising with children his own age. They prefer him to socialise with those closer to their age, usually at the tennis club. So Brian doesn't get that kind of crucial socialisation that most children get from being around others their own age. So he's hanging around people of a completely different generation to him. When Brian was a small child, Jacqueline and Sidney would have been in their 40s and 50s respectively, so that's the age group Brian was socialised around. Brian's mother, Jacqueline, was, as I say, devoted to her son, and Brian, in many ways, had the kind of love and support a lot of children could only dream of, but according to Brian, that did sometimes have a tendency to cross that line, from love and support to smothering and control. It's said that Jackie was pretty strict and rather dominating over both her son and her husband, but especially over Brian. As I said, she only allowed him to socialise with their friends at the tennis club. She also had his entire schooling mapped out to get him the career that she thought he should have. Brian himself said that she also still insisted on washing his hair and bathing him right up until the age of 17, which at that age is not appropriate behaviour, and there's no doubt that that's going to have an impact of some description. And so when it comes to school, Brian struggles a little to make friends. He isn't an outcast or anything like that, he just isn't really close to anyone, and his chosen way of trying to make friends is not one that's ever going to end well. The only way he knows how to get attention from the other kids is to embellish the truth. He believes that if he adds little flourishes to his stories that he'll impress them, and in his mind they're more likely to be impressed by him and want to hang out with him. And from a very young age he starts to tell lies, and the older he gets the more exaggerated those lies become. So moving forward a few years, and Brian is now 17, soon to turn 18, and of the age when he needs to start applying to universities in anticipation of him taking his A-levels. As we know, Brian excels at science and hopes to study medicine to become a doctor, which luckily his parents approve of. Jacqueline would often talk about her son to friends and neighbours, and when asked if he planned to be a doctor, his mother would correct them, saying, "No, he won't be just a doctor, he'll be a brain surgeon." So with this career path in mind, Brian applies to Nottingham University with the intention of commencing his studies in the autumn of 2004. Now, his parents would much prefer that he goes to Edinburgh University. They prefer the uni and the location, and so Sydney, Brian's dad, telephones the admissions officer at Edinburgh University, and he changes Brian's choice of uni from Nottingham to Edinburgh because they believe that that is the correct option for Brian, but also because when Brian goes to uni, they actually plan to follow him there and move to the city too, and they prefer Edinburgh. So given that Brian isn't very well practised in socialisation, and the fact that he's under a lot of pressure to be this superstar brain surgeon someday, Brian's way of processing that is to create a fantasy world in his own mind. He doesn't get a say in his own life, and so his fantasy life is completely under his own control. This starts with little white lies, and gradually the lies become more elaborate and more exaggerated the older he gets. He starts to tell school friends that he's a very gifted tennis player and is in fact en route to being put forward as a future professional. Now, Brian is good at tennis, he's been playing for years and is the tennis team captain at school, but aside from that, there's certainly no outstanding gift there that would make him a future international pro. But that doesn't stop Brian, who, being the extrovert that he is, will tell anyone who'll listen about how gifted he is. Brian even goes as far as to find the document which shows the Lawn Tennis Association rankings, and he doctors it to show his name right at the top. It now read that the #1 player was Brian Blackwell. In reality, he wasn't even ranked at all, never mind in the #1 spot. Brian goes on to tell schoolmates how he's been given a sponsorship from a tennis company, which technically he has. He has got a sponsorship with them, but it's the lowest level that the company offer, which involves solely getting a discount on tennis equipment. It's nothing more than that. It's the kind of discount that a lot of people would have access to. But Brian's not stopping there. He then tells his friends that he's also got a full sponsorship deal from Nike. The Nike, one of the most renowned sports brands there is. This sponsorship comes with a yearly salary of around £45,000 and various other luxury perks. But it isn't just his friends that he wants to show off to. There's someone in particular that he wants to impress, and that is a young lady named Amal Shaba. Amal is 17 years old, the same age as Brian, and lives with her now divorced mother and her sister. Amal goes to the same school as Brian, and her parents are doctors, so she, like Brian, hopes to study medicine and become a doctor, just like her parents. Due to the two having similar aspirations in life, they study the same subjects, and so they have that in common, and they become friends, and as the years pass, they begin a relationship. As we know, Brian's sense of self-worth is directly connected to how he appears to others, hence his propensity to lie, and he exhibits that same behaviour in his relationship with Amal. He feels the need to lie to impress her, to keep her as his girlfriend, and he spins the same tale to her about how he is exceptionally gifted at tennis, and as a result, how he has sponsorship deals with the best brands in the business, and he's very aware that now he needs to start taking steps to prove to Amal that everything he's saying is true. He tells Amal that he has a sponsorship with Nike, and due to his rankings as one of the best young tennis players in the country, he's been pegged as a future professional, and with that comes a lot of perks, particularly financial ones. He starts to buy Amal gifts that are of a price tag that is in keeping with his new income, which includes gifting her some jewellery. Amal is absolutely amazed by these beautiful pieces of jewellery that Brian has bought her, and she shows them to her mother, who requests that Brian give her the receipts so she can get these high-end items placed on her insurance, which Brian agrees to do but then never shows up with them. The problem being is that these gifts are all cheap costume jewellery. None of them are real. It has been said that Amal's mother asked for the receipts because she was suspicious that these jewels weren't the real deal, but it could also be that knowing Amal is only 17, it's not ideal to keep such expensive items in the care of a teenager, and she wanted to protect them just in case they were lost or damaged. But either way, Brian never produces these receipts. He always finds a reason not to, and in the end, Amal's mother just drops the matter. Brian then tells Amal that due to his contract with Nike that he can hire a PA to manage his affairs, and the salary that comes with that role is a whopping £80,000 per year. Obviously, Amal jumps at the chance, and in April 2004, Brian hands her a contract confirming her new role for her to sign. And when I say contract, I mean he literally painstakingly put together a full, genuine-looking employment contract from Nike that Amal could sign. He'd clearly put a lot of effort into this. For a 17-year-old to write up a contract of employment is quite something, and he did it for the same reason that he got her all of that jewellery, in order to convince Amal that his stories were true. As an advance on her salary for this role, Brian writes Amal a cheque for £39,000, but in reality, Brian has less than 50 pence in his bank account, so of course it bounces when she tries to cash it, and again, Brian somehow manages to lie his way out of it. I have to assume that he was able to do this primarily because Amal was a 17-year-old girl, and I know a lot of us are incredibly naive at that age. But to be fair, when someone is an incredible liar, people of all ages can be fooled. There's really no limits as to what people are willing to believe if someone is a good enough liar, and Brian is. And remember, he is very intelligent for his age, so we aren't dealing with your average teenager here. We're dealing with the kind of teenager that can sit at home and draw up an employment contract to the point where it looks credible enough for someone to sign and believe that they're employed by Nike. At some point during this, Amal's friends grow a little suspicious of Brian. In private, they question some of the things he's told her, and due to that, Amal goes on the internet to find out if what he's saying is true, but she doesn't really look that hard. She's in awe of him, she wants to believe it, so she never confronts him about it. And once he shows up with the jewellery and an employment contract, that really seals the deal for her. This must be real. Plus, when someone is constantly doubling down on these lies like Brian is, he's overwhelming her with information, and the easiest thing to do is to just accept it. In her mind, she's seen the proof now, and that's enough for her. So I mentioned that there's other perks to this Nike sponsorship as well as the salary. Brian tells Amal that as well as the money, there is also accommodation provided in this sponsorship that he's entitled to live in. The flat, according to Brian, is a £450,000 luxury apartment in the same complex as England and Liverpool football player Steven Gerrard. Amal, of course, frequently asks to visit this luxury apartment, but surprisingly, Brian always has a reason why she can't. But Brian doesn't just get a luxury apartment, he also gets to choose a brand new Mercedes too, at Nike's expense. So Brian takes Amal on a very exciting trip to visit the most upmarket car showrooms in Liverpool so that he can pick out his brand new car. The car dealer showing Brian around has to actually take Brian on the test drive because at this point, Brian can't even drive. Whilst looking around the showroom, Amal mentions that she'd love to have a car herself, and this comment stays with Brian, so much so that a little while later he makes a trip to the bank. Brian is aware that his parents have a trust fund for him. They've been saving money for his future education, which so far amounts to a total of £9,000. But as much as it's their savings, it's under his name too, so he's able to access it, and he does, taking the entire amount out of the bank and purchasing a Ford car for Amal as a gift. Now, this is just my opinion, but after the cheque bounces for £39,000, Brian probably feels like he needs a big gesture to keep Amal believing his lies. And of course, if your 17-year-old boyfriend buys you a car outright, that's going to do the trick, for the moment at least. And that's just my interpretation of why he might have bought that car, but who knows. The problem is, it doesn't take long for Jacqueline to realise what Brian's done, because whilst that trust fund is in his name, his parents set it up, so they'll know if something changes with it, and it's at this point that his parents confront him. When they find out that he spent his entire education fund on a gift, they are, of course, incredibly upset. That was their investment in his future, and he's withdrawn the whole lot and bought his girlfriend a car with it. They, of course, immediately say that Amal has to return the car, but it's eventually decided that Amal will keep the car but pay them back the money. And to be honest, I have no idea how his lies don't all unravel at that moment. All I can think is that Brian must have kept his parents well away from Amal and came up with some kind of other reason as to why he couldn't pay for it, but I've no idea what that would be. Whatever it was, it did the trick. Now that Brian has drained his trust fund and is certainly not getting any cash from his parents anytime soon, he needs money to be able to continue this fantasy life that he's created in his own mind. And so he takes a trip to the bank, telling a bank manager that he needs a loan. He claims that he's a professional tennis player earning £45,000 a year. He says he needs the money because he's playing in the French Open tournament in the summer and that he'll pay it back later with his salary. He says that he needs the money now because his father has died, so he hasn't access to the funds he needs anymore. His father, of course, hasn't died at all. He's very much alive. Jacqueline, knowing that Brian has drained his trust fund and is trying to access money in other ways, calls in at that bank to say that she's concerned about Brian's behaviour. And that's when she finds out about this loan and asks them to cancel that application because it's invalid. The information on the application simply isn't true. Somehow Brian manages to smooth it over with his parents, but this really shocks them and makes them realise that something's very wrong here and they need to keep an eye on him. But although Jacqueline manages to get the loan stopped, Brian's behaviour doesn't stop. He applies for a total of 13 credit cards in his parents' names. Brian then comes up with his latest story, which is that he's going to Milan to play in a tennis tournament, and he asks Amal if she wants to go with him. She, of course, is very excited and says yes. But a few days later, Brian tells her it's not possible because he didn't realise that girlfriends weren't allowed. So he says he'll have to take this trip on his own and he'll make it up to her with the next trip. He says he has another tournament in the summer in the US, so she can go with him then. So off he goes to Milan, and he doesn't attend school for the next 3 days. He's texting Amal the whole time though to let her know how he's getting on. He texts her saying, "I'm just about to go into court, wish me luck. I've just met Roger Federer," and she's incredibly impressed. He's just met Roger Federer. She's starstruck for him. I think we can assume those texts Brian sent came directly from inside his own house. So summer rolls around and Brian sticks to his promise that he'll take Amal to his summer tournament in the US, and they're both very excited and they start planning their trip. This entire trip is again completely funded by Nike, so there's really no limit as to the kind of holiday they're able to plan. It's really a trip of a lifetime. And so on the 25th of July 2004, they book their flights and their hotels. On the day of the trip, Brian gets a taxi to Amal's house. He's running a little late getting to her house, but she thinks nothing of it, and away they go. The pair fly business class from Manchester to JFK, and they then hop in a limo that Brian has arranged to take them from the airport to the very upmarket Plaza Hotel in New York. No expense has been spared, and Brian has gotten one of the best suites in the entire hotel. This suite usually welcomes celebrities and even presidents. The room they're in overlooks Central Park, and Amal cannot believe her luck. It's really incredible, and to make it even more incredible, their £4,000 evening meal consists of lobster, oysters and caviar. And the next day they take a walk down Fifth Avenue, and Brian tells her she can have any designer gift of her choosing. Then the couple move on in their trip to tour San Francisco and then Miami, which is where Brian's meant to be playing his tennis tournament, but it's cancelled at the last minute due to the weather being unsuitable. Shocker. And then they go on to Barbados. Brian calls his parents several times whilst out there to check in and to let them know that he's having a blast. The trip in total costs £30,000. The pair return home and pull up at Brian's parents' house, but it looks like they've gone away. His parents go to a villa in Spain frequently, so they assume that's the case. But the problem is that Brian doesn't have his house key, so Amal says, well, no problem, and she invites him to stay at her house. Her mother gives it the okay, and he takes her up on the offer. A week passes and it's time for Brian to collect his A-level results in August of 2004. So he goes into college and of course he's done incredibly well. All A's across the board in maths, chemistry, biology and Spanish. He's over the moon and he tells his teacher as much. Although he does comment that it's a bit off that his parents haven't returned from holiday to celebrate this happy news. But it doesn't dampen it too much for him. He's got his qualifications and this is confirmation that he's all set to study medicine at university. Meanwhile, back at Brian's parents' home, the neighbours notice that their post is piling up and so they head over to the house to collect it. It wouldn't be the first time, as they often collect the mail when the Blackwells go on holiday. The reason being is that the porch door is left unlocked and so any personal information posted through the porch door could be stolen. So what the neighbours usually do is they take the mail from the porch via the unlocked door and then they post it through the locked front door and take any parcels away for safekeeping. So a neighbour called Pete Boyle goes over and picks all the mail up and pops it through the letterbox of the front door. But as he does so, he realises there's a terribly pungent smell coming from inside the house. Pete takes a couple of steps back and he looks at the door and he sees that there's flies on the panes of glass on the inside. Then he takes a few more steps back and looks at the house as a whole and he realises that the front windows of the house on the inside are all covered in black flies. That must have been a jarring sight, to say the least. Pete has passed the house many times over the weeks, but it's only when he really looks on this particular day that he sees that the windows are crawling with flies. Pete walks around the house to the kitchen window and it looks pretty normal. He looks down towards their kitchen flooring, which he assumes is black. That is until he realises that that blackness is moving. The part of the floor in his line of vision is entirely covered in black flies. It's at this point that Pete calls the police and gets them over straight away. So the police look around the house and they spot broken glass along the side of the house and it seems a window has been broken. So they assume a robbery has taken place and they gain entry to see what, if anything, has been taken and to check on the welfare of the Blackwells. Upon entering the house, they realise that in the lounge and in the bathroom are the dead bodies of Sydney and Jacqueline Blackwell. The police take no further steps as this is clearly now a crime scene and they need to preserve the area to avoid any interference with potential evidence. Initially it's assumed that the couple have been shot. Both bodies are pretty decomposed by this point so it's not easy to tell, but given that there's a smashed window at the side of the house, it's assumed that this is a robbery and the Blackwells have either caught these robbers in the act and they've been shot as a result, or they have been taken hostage and they've not survived the ordeal. The next task for the police is to find Brian to tell him about his parents, and they find him still living at Amal's. They tell him his parents have been found dead in their home and he reacts how you'd imagine he would. He's shocked and upset. He's finding it difficult to believe, saying it can't be them, they're in Spain. It's at this point that the police have had the cause of death report back and they realise that the couple haven't actually been shot. Their cause of death is entirely different to that. The police continue to speak to Brian, not as a suspect, but he was the last to see them alive, so he no doubt will have crucial information about their last days that the police need. And whilst he's cooperating to a degree, it seems to the police that Brian knows more than he's telling them. They become even more suspicious when Brian asks an officer, completely out of the blue, if prison is cold. They're already suspicious of Brian, and that comment just doesn't sound right to police at all. And it's at this point in September 2004 that they arrest Brian on suspicion of murder. The police question Brian and he seems pretty confident. He's no longer the shocked, confused, upset boy they spoke to in Amal's house. The police start by simply asking for Brian's account of the last 6 weeks before he went on holiday, which was the last time he'd seen them. And they don't stop him or challenge what he says, they just let him speak. But once finished, Brian starts to question them. He questions why he's being asked irrelevant questions, saying he should be there as a witness, not a suspect. He says if he's been arrested, then so should the surrounding neighbours too, as they've had just as much access to the house as he's had. He says he's been on holiday the entire time, so how could he be responsible? But unbeknownst to Brian, whilst he's at the station being questioned, the police are searching Amal's house where he's been staying, and they make a shocking discovery. A bag is found in the garage that belongs to Brian. It's in the garage because Amal's mother had asked Brian to put it there because it smelled so bad. When the police open it, they find two items which crack the case wide open. One is Brian's house keys, which he'd been claiming for weeks that he didn't have, and the other is a blood-stained claw hammer. Police immediately let Brian know what they found, and he knows he's got nowhere to run now, and he makes a confession. He tells police that on the day in question, he was putting up posters on his wall in his bedroom, and he made his way into the lounge where his father was, and apparently his father was drunk. A discussion with his father starts, but it soon gets heated and turns violent on Sydney's part. He says it progresses to the point where he feels it necessary to retaliate, and he hits his father back with the hammer he's been using to put the pictures on the wall. He says that hitting him was a split-second reaction. Then he says that his mother in the kitchen hears that something's going on and enters with a carving knife in her hand, making stabbing motions, and he again retaliates with the hammer. He then takes the knife from her and stabs her. He says at the time he was not sure who he'd struck, where or how many times. He says there was lots of blood and his mother asked him, "What did you do?" He says that he sat with his father for a while in shock at what he'd done to him, and he told him he loved him. He says he then looked at his mother and she looked like she may still be alive. She didn't look how he thought a dead person should look. He says he didn't think the blade had gone in that deep and couldn't believe that someone could die so easily, as it only seemed like a bit of commotion. He says for some reason he can't explain, he pulled her to the bathroom and splashed some water on her face and asked her to come back, but of course she didn't, she was already deceased by this point. So the police get their confession that Brian killed his parents in self-defence, but then they get the forensic reports back and all is not as it seems. Sydney Blackwell had received massive head injuries consistent with being struck multiple times with a hammer. He had also received several stab wounds to the left side of his face and upper chest. Sydney also had slash wounds to his arms and hands, which were most likely caused when he raised his arms in self-defence. It was also noted that no evidence of a struggle was found in the room that Sydney died in. No ornaments or furniture was out of place that was consistent with Sydney being violent towards Brian and the pair becoming physical. And most crucially, the evidence was able to show police that Sydney was actually struck from behind. This 71-year-old unsuspecting man was sitting quietly in his chair reading the TV listings when he was attacked from behind with a claw hammer and then stabbed. Jacqueline was found in the bathroom after having been dragged in there after the attack, in keeping what Brian told them, but she was found face down on the bathroom floor. So let's go back to before Brian and Amal went on holiday and go over what police believe actually happened, which is quite different to what Brian told them. As we know, Jacqueline has found out about Brian's spending and has visited the bank to cancel any applications that he's made for loans. She's also found out about the car Brian had bought Amal and arranged for Amal to pay for the car herself, much to Brian's humiliation. She's even mentioned to friends that Brian is getting out of hand and she's very concerned about his behaviour, which seems to be spiralling. Brian, however, at this point has already promised Amal that they're going on this trip where he'll be playing tennis in a tournament in America, which is all expenses paid. But as we know, in the real world, he doesn't have a Nike sponsorship, so he needs to pay for this somehow. Him just telling her they can't go simply isn't an option. On July 25th, 2004, Brian and his dad go to the tennis club and Brian has a game whilst his dad sits and waits, telling his friends about his son's hard work and how proud he is of him and his dedication to studying for his A-levels. What the police believe happens then is that upon returning home from the tennis club, Brian finds his father's credit card and takes it. He books 2 tickets from Manchester Airport to New York for him and Amal. The tickets he buys are business class, costing upwards of £5,000. Now, it's either shortly before this booking or shortly after this booking has been made that Jacqueline and Sydney find out about this holiday, and they basically tell him he isn't going. He doesn't have the money to pay for something like this, and they will not allow him to take a trip using money that doesn't belong to him. The problem Brian has is that he's made a promise to Amal and he cannot allow that promise to be broken. And his parents saying enough is enough will mean he can't deliver what he said he will, and he'll be utterly humiliated. All of his lies will be discovered and he cannot let that happen under any circumstances. And now Brian is cornered. He needs this trip to happen. Cancelling is not an option. This fantasy life he's created can't just end. He knows his parents need to be out of the picture to keep his lies intact. He has a claw hammer in his hand, and he decides to use it. Brian waits until his father is seated in his chair and reading. He approaches him from behind and hits his 71-year-old father over the head with the claw hammer, delivering several brutal blows, one after the other. The police believe that Brian's mother Jacqueline, who's been in the kitchen, hears this happening in the other room and runs in holding a knife and sees Brian attacking Sydney. She tries to stop him, but he hits her over the head with the hammer, then takes the knife from her and stabs her in the chest as many as 20 times. This kills his mother outright, so he turns his attention back to Sydney, who has been badly beaten, and stabs him to death. This was the ferocious and frenzied attack of a young man who saw his web of lies on the brink of being destroyed, and discovered by the one person whose opinion mattered most, Amal's, and this wasn't something he could even contemplate happening. So he took action, making very sure that his parents were dead so that there was no chance of them surviving, and revealing his deceit. As per his confession, Brian did drag his mother's dead body into the bathroom as evidenced by the drag marks on the floor, but no one can be sure why he did that. They only have his word that it was to splash water in her face, but he is quite clearly a very experienced liar, so who knows. After bludgeoning his parents to death, Brian removes his bloody clothes that he's been wearing during the attack and takes them out into the back garden. There he burns them in an incinerator. Meanwhile, Amal is wondering where he is. She's ordered a taxi to pick him up to take him to her house to start their big adventure to the US, but he doesn't show, so the taxi drives away. Shortly after the killings, Brian realises he's missed his taxi, and so he orders another one. When it arrives, he gets in, but then gets back out again in order to go say goodbye to his parents. Minutes later, he returns and gets in the taxi. Police found that taxi driver who drove Brian to Amal's that night, and he says Brian was perfectly normal, calm, and even maintained a conversation during the journey. He told the driver how he was going to America on holiday and how excited he was. The driver sensed absolutely nothing out of the ordinary about this boy who had just killed his parents. His going back into the house to say goodbye was purely a performance for the driver, Brian's way of showing that his parents were still alive when he left the house, should the driver ever be called as a witness. And the couple's holiday commences. As we know, they travel to multiple locations and live in the lap of luxury for weeks, spending tens of thousands of pounds using Brian's father's credit cards, whilst his parents lay undiscovered in their home, killed at the hands of their own son. Of course, Amal has no idea about any of this. She's under the impression the entire trip has all been financed by Nike, but not only that, Brian's behaviour doesn't give away any clues at all as to what he's done or the gruesome scene that he's left behind. According to Amal, Brian did not remotely act in any way other than a happy young man who was having the time of his life. There's home video footage of Amal filming their hotel suite, and you can see Brian is there, laughing and enjoying himself, having an incredible time. If you remember, I said that on several occasions Brian rang home to speak to his parents to let them know how his holiday was going. But of course, he was talking to himself, because whilst he was making these fake phone calls, his parents were laid dead in their home, brutally murdered by him. After the holiday, when the couple get back, the police think that Brian probably assumed by this time his parents would have been discovered and he'd be able to make his grand entrance and look shocked and devastated. He expects to see the house taped off by police, but it isn't. It's still completely untouched and just as he left it, because by this point the neighbours still haven't collected the mail. So as we know, he goes to Amal's saying he doesn't have his key, but he does. His key is in his bag the whole time, along with the murder weapon. And Brian does re-enter his parents' house several times whilst they lay there undiscovered, unknown of course to Amal. He collects some documents, a few photographs, and on one occasion he goes in and gets a bottle of wine to give to Amal's mother as a thank you gift for allowing him to stay. He's able to walk in and out of that house collecting various items, knowing his parents' decomposing bodies are in there, and yet that still isn't enough for him to own up and allow his parents to be finally discovered so that they can have some dignity and be laid to rest. So because his parents haven't been discovered whilst he's been away, as per his plan, Brian then takes matters into his own hands as a way of bringing this situation to a close. Brian goes into Kirby, a nearby town, and finds two young men standing in the street. He offers them some cash in return for burning down a house for him. No prizes for guessing which house he has in mind. He tells the men that this house belongs to someone he knows, a drug dealer, and this drug dealer has wronged him, so he wants to burn down his property as an act of revenge. Problem is, Brian seriously underestimates these two young men. He's obviously prejudged them and thinks they're the type to just accept money to do a job, no questions asked. But Brian sticks out like a sore thumb. His accent is different to the local area, he's dressed differently, and he just looks suspicious to them, and they turn his offer down, ironically believing Brian to be an undercover police officer. So Brian's plan to burn his parents' house down with his parents still in it is a non-starter. And we know the rest of the story. Brian collects his A-level results, commenting how he's disappointed his parents are not there to see him receive them. Knowing his parents as we do by this point, we know that more than anything else, if there's one thing that Brian's parents would attend, it would be his results day, the day that impacts his entire education and future career prospects. The only reason they aren't there is because he made sure they weren't, 6 weeks before. When the police entered the property, the little details about how they found Jacqueline and Sydney is what makes this so sad. The fact that Sydney was sat in his chair, completely unaware of what was about to happen to him. The TV listings open in front of him. His glasses were still in his hand. And the drag marks showing that for some reason Jacqueline had been attacked and then moved into the bathroom and left for dead. All this whilst their son, just an hour later, gets into a taxi acting like any other excited teenage holidaymaker, telling his driver all about the trip he was about to take. So back at the station just days after his arrest, Brian is charged with murder, and this story hits the headlines, and those who know of him are in complete shock. They tell the press that they didn't think him capable of this at all. They saw him as a polite and bright young man. He was the last person anyone suspected of being capable of this, but perhaps they just didn't know him that well. 9 months after his arrest, Brian goes to his court hearing in June 2005 at the Liverpool Crown Court. Whilst he was initially charged with murder, Brian pleads guilty to the lesser charge of manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility. He's able to plead this because 5 separate psychiatrists assess Brian and they all diagnose him with the same thing, NPD, or Narcissistic Personality Disorder. According to the Mayo Clinic, NPD is a mental condition in which people have an inflated sense of their own importance, a deep need for excessive attention and admiration, troubled relationships, and a lack of empathy for others. But behind this mask of extreme confidence lies a fragile self-esteem that's vulnerable to the slightest criticism. They expect unquestioning compliance with their expectations. They're preoccupied with fantasies about success, power, and brilliance. They insist on having the best of everything, including things like their car and their home, etc. There's a lot more characteristics than that, but I think we can all agree that based on his actions, this all sounds exactly like Brian. It's worth noting that this diagnosis is very rarely used for someone as young as Brian, and he was described at his court hearing as a highly abnormal young man. Sufferers of narcissistic personality disorder typically fly into a rage if their fantasy world is threatened, and it would seem that that's what happened with Brian on that day. He feared all of his lies being discovered, and he murdered his parents to avoid that from happening. The police were very clear in making the point that they investigated whether Brian was pushed to breaking point by his parents, but there was no evidence of a troubled childhood, and whilst there was a lot of expectations on Brian, there was nothing to suggest that he'd been pushed too far in his studies, and that he found achieving A grades on a consistent basis quite easy. Then a statement is read out at the court hearing on Brian's behalf. In it, he speaks of his remorse for his actions and how he's facing up to what he's done by taking steps such as attending anger management sessions. He says, "For every moment of every day, I wish I could turn back the hands of time. I eternally long to be a little boy again, at a time when everyone really loved each other, when we could have a happy time and be a family once more. I miss them more than anything in the world. The guilt will punish and haunt me for 24 hours a day for the rest of my life." And then it's time for sentencing, at which point the judge says that Brian showed breathtaking callousness in his chilling crime. He said, "For a son to do this is almost beyond belief. You are no ordinary son." The judge says in his sentencing that he's taking into account that NPD is untreatable and will likely always be a part of Brian for the rest of his life. It's at this point that Brian Blackwell is sentenced to life imprisonment on June 29th, 2005. The minimum tariff that the judge set meant Brian would be eligible for parole by 2010, and it's now 2020 and Brian is still behind bars, so clearly no parole board has deemed Brian fit for release just yet. As for Amal, Brian wrote a lot of letters to her trying to get her to visit him in prison, but she point blank refused. Amal said she was in enormous shock at what Brian had done. She said, "I am angry because he ruined my ability to trust. But my overwhelming feeling now is relief that I got away, that it didn't get worse, and that I wasn't a victim too. For the 2 weeks after the police came to arrest him, I was devastated. I was crying all day. I spent all day in bed, I couldn't eat, and I had nightmares." In the end, she did decide to go visit him to confront him about what he'd done, but she said he was still very much in denial and still trying to find excuses and talk his way out of things. She said she felt incredibly guilty too, that she didn't see the lies, but she was young, she was naive, and Brian was an accomplished liar. Not only that, but the whole time that he was telling her lies, he would write reams of notes about what he'd told her so that he never forgot them and never slipped up. He was so methodical and thorough, he approached his lies in the same way he approached his school studies. Brian is still in prison to this day. He has a job in the library which he's very good at, and he is said to be a model prisoner. But that's not surprising. Apparently someone with MPD is likely to make the effort to come across as a model prisoner who is accepting of what they did and is remorseful. But the problem is that you can never be totally sure. NPD does not simply go away, and people who suffer with it are very accomplished at lying, so how can you ever really know that this remorse they speak of is genuine? They could just be telling their therapists what they want to hear in order to get what they want, which is to be released back onto the streets. But Brian has said a few interesting things to various people whilst he's been in jail. He said that when he returned to the family home after his holiday, he was very concerned, but not about what you might think. He said he was concerned because he knew his goldfish and cat were trapped inside the house and he wanted to make sure that they were okay. He's also said in the past that he's relieved his parents are gone and that they can no longer control his every move. He said that overall he enjoys prison because if he doesn't want to eat his vegetables, he doesn't have to. Let me know what you think about this case. I'm intrigued to know your opinions on this one. It's certainly an incredibly sad case. Jacqueline and Sydney were so desperate for a child. For them to die in such a frenzied attack at the hands of their own son is horrific. Not to mention the fact that even after this, they lay dead for 6 weeks whilst he had the holiday of a lifetime without showing a shred of remorse. The relatives that they left behind were shattered by this. Not only that the couple's lives were taken, but that they were taken so brutally, and by the person that they brought into the world. And that's it. I hope you enjoyed this video. I think this is a really interesting case, and as I say, I'd love to know your opinions on this one. If you did like this video, please give me a like and subscribe to my channel. I've got a lot more videos planned and I'd love for you to stick around to see them. My Twitter handle is down below in the description too if you'd like to follow me over on there. Have a great day, stay safe, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.